This week, our episode features our annual 10 Best Books list, which was recorded live via Zoom earlier this week. We'll be back with our regular podcast next Friday, December 10th. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those joining us from Europe and points further east, and good very early in the morning to our West Coast friends. I'm Pamela Paul, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Welcome to our announcement of the 10 best books of 2021. We're so happy to have you here with us today. And a reminder that we are recording for the Book Review podcast. If you're not already a podcast subscriber, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. This is our second year holding the 10 Best Books announcement event in a virtual format. And while we miss seeing people in person, one of the great joys of doing it virtually is that it opens the event up to more people. And it's a chance for us to bring together book people from all around the world. So we're thrilled to have you here. I also want to give a big thank you for being a Times subscriber. Your subscriptions make our work here possible. Choosing the 10 best books each year is actually a year-long process. Believe it or not, my colleagues and I have already started work on the 2022 list. So thank you for supporting our journalism. Speaking of my colleagues, I am thrilled to welcome some of my colleagues from the Book Review who are joining us here today. We have our West Coast correspondent, Gal Beckerman, Lauren Christensen, Gregory Coles, Emily Aiken, Elizabeth Egan, MJ Franklin, Tina Jordan, Dave Kim, and John Williams. Good morning, everyone. I know all of us who work on the Book Review are excited to finally share this list, and I want to give all of you some context about how the list comes together. People ask us all the time, what makes a book a best book? For us, a best book is a book that stands on the merits of its prose and its storytelling, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and succeeds on the terms that the author set out for it. The book may be of the moment, but it's also a book that we think transcends the moment and will stand the test of time. We don't choose books because we necessarily agree with them, support a political or intellectual message forwarded by them, or personally like the authors. We don't choose books merely because we consider them important or worthy. The best books have to succeed in all ways, on all levels. We choose these books because we think these books offer a level of achievement that readers have come to expect from the New York Times. It's impossible to fully convey what it takes to get here, but let me say this. When I call this a year-long process, I mean it. We start this list as soon as we end the last one. As I mentioned, we've already begun work on 2022. The bulk of the work is reading, of course, and a lot of it, but after that comes deep discussion in which editors at the Book Review, many of whom are here today, talk about these books with no holds barred. We discuss, we debate, we strongly disagree with one another, but we listen to one another's arguments, and we continue to read ourselves, and ultimately, after months of deliberation, we vote. One major change this year, and speaking of years, we used to cut off the contenders with our holiday issue at the beginning of December. This year, we included books for the full calendar year 2021, which we will do moving forward, in addition to books that were published at the end of 2020, but not in time for best books. And we wind up with what we have here today, 5 fiction and 5 nonfiction books that we consider to be the best of 2021. So without further ado, let's get into it. Starting with fiction, and in no particular order, our first fiction book is How Beautiful We Were by Mbolo Mabue. Elizabeth, can you tell us a little bit more about this book?
Of course, Pamela, thank you. The author of Behold the Dreamers brings us a second novel that is anything but sophomoric. In this book, we go to Kasawa, a fictional African village where kids are dying as a result of environmental mayhem caused by an American oil company called Pexton. The fields are fallow, the water is poisoned, And Mbue launches readers into a David and Goliath story that spans decades, told from multiple perspectives. Perhaps most powerfully, the perspective of Tula, who leads a resistance movement, and also the voices of a chorus of children who demonstrate how the devastation has affected their own lives and how they summon their own power to do something about it. How Beautiful We Were is not a sad book, despite how I am making it sound right now. It's ambitious, elegant, wise, and Mbue lets in light and hope where you least expect it. The vibe is perhaps best summed up by a line towards the end of the book from one of the villagers who says, "Why do we all fight when we want the same things?" Gal, I know you loved this book too, so maybe you can weigh in a little bit about what you thought.
I did. I can't ever remember reading such a humane and even sort of joyful book about neocolonialism. This is, I love that it's essentially the story of Kasawa, the village that you mentioned, and what it means to the people who live there, how it's spoiled by outside forces, and how it is defended over the generations that we see kind of covered within the span of this book. And I was just so impressed with how deeply she brings us into the world of this village, of its rhythms, its characters, and that age cohort that you mentioned that we watch grow up over time as they're struggling to figure out how to resist. Some of the most satisfying parts of the book to me were actually these sort of almost intellectual, philosophical arguments between the villagers about the best way to make change. And which is a hard thing to dramatize. They're talking about the most effective forms of resistance. There's scenes where the elders are pleading caution and negotiation, and the younger militant people want to resort to violence. But what she does so wonderfully there is she shows us their helplessness, and how hard it is to escape the feeling that nothing will change. But also, their constant attempts at agency in the face of it, this sense of their persistence and resilience that seems to constantly renew itself.
You both make me want to reread it. All right. Our second fiction book is Intimacies by Katie Kitamura. MJ, over to you.
I am so excited to talk about this book, Intimacies by Katie Kitamura. I fell in love with it when I first read it, and I feel like I've been keeping it a secret and just wanting to share it with so many people. The book is about a woman who moves to The Hague, and she's just figuring out her life. She's trying to figure out what home means to her after the loss of her parents. She starts a relationship with a man who is separated from his wife, but may or may not be over her. She's trying to settle into this new place, and all of a sudden, she is assigned to work as an interpreter for a man on trial in the International Court for War Crimes. And all of a sudden, she realizes that she is now the voice of this man who has done unspeakable things. And so the book is about her trying to figure out who she is as she's in this very malleable, untethered place. At the same time, she's trying to figure out who this war criminal is and what does it mean that she is his voice. Who is this man that she started this romance with? She befriends a woman whose brother is attacked in The Hague, and she's trying to figure him out. What I loved about this book is it's so layered. You get the sense that every single sentence is doing double and triple duty in the way that it is revealing and obscuring something about these characters. And when I read it, I think I frantically tweeted something like, have you ever read something that is written so precisely that it's exciting? That's what this book is. It is exciting to see on a sentence by sentence level what Katie Kitamura is doing. And then when you get to the end of the book, you almost want to reread it immediately to figure out, what did I miss? Now that I know all of these things from these characters, what was Katie signaling in her prose initially that I just didn't understand because I didn't know these characters? The last thing I'll say about this book is there's something so revealing about the way it approaches the idea of intimacy, is how we know someone. It's almost, to me, a little bit funny that the more you get to know some of these characters, the more slippery they seem. They don't seem unimpeachable in the way that you initially think they are, minus the war criminal. He's pretty impeachable. But some of the other characters that you meet, you you really get closer to them and you start to question them, and in the process start to question the narrator and the narrator's fixation on them. It is so layered, it is so thoughtful, it is so precise, and it is brilliant. Greg, I know you love this book as well.
I did love it, and for a lot of the same reasons that you're talking about, especially that doubling and tripling of meaning there. It's a very spare, very precise, very elegant book. It's not a long book. It feels like everything extraneous has been chiseled away, but what's left just resonates. It chimes on so many different registers. One of the things I love about this book is how destabilizing it is. It builds its story out of a steady series of misapprehensions and adjustments on the narrator's part. From the very beginning, when she realizes that the Hague's kind of sterile and civilized personality is in fact a strictly enforced facade covering up chaos, to a painting that she sees at the Moritz Swiss Museum, whose significance keeps shifting as she notices new details, to her impressions of a house she's about to visit, the sister of the man who was attacked. And she's viewing it from the street before she realizes that's actually not the right house at all. She's looking at the downstairs neighbor's apartment. So she's an interpreter who keeps misinterpreting things, and it just reinforces the book's sense of contingency. You can't be certain of anything in it. She can't be certain of anything in it, but you still have to somehow make a life in the midst of all this uncertainty.
Our third book in fiction is When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut. John, you were an early fan.
Thanks, Pamela. I was a huge fan. In fact, this is one of those books I'm sure I annoyed people with my proselytizing. You know, you step up to that edge of getting people's nerves when you love a book so much. In this job, I'm sure all of us would agree, it's rare enough to admire something strongly enough to consider it one of the year's best books. It's even more rare when something gets you sitting bolt upright in your chair within the first page or two of reading it. And that's what happened with me with this book, and the feeling never went away. The short way to describe Labatut's book is that it's about physics. Not an easy sell for fiction readers, not all of them, so hear me out. For a writer to mix fact and fiction is a cliche at this point, and yet the feeling I had while reading Labatut's book, and that's what he does in it, is that he had somehow created something entirely new, a new format. In less than 200 pages, he takes us through the history of 20th century physics using real-life figures like Einstein, Heisenberg, and Schrödinger. But this is not in the least a dry book. He uses incredible details to make very cinematic moments happen, including one early on in which the scientist Karl Schwarzschild from the battlefield solves the equations of Einstein's general relativity and sends Einstein a letter from the battlefield saying that he's done this and showing him and introducing essentially the concept of black holes. And Einstein, who didn't expect this to be solved in his lifetime, gathers himself after realizing what he's looking at and writes back to Schwarzschild. And as Labatut says, not realizing that he was writing to a dead man because he had died during the war. There are just episodes like that throughout the book that keep you just glued to the page. It starts with a riveting, mostly nonfiction chapter about the grim delirium of the final days of the Nazi regime and about Fritz Haber, a chemist who not only saved much of the world from starvation with his science, but also developed and weaponized poisonous gases to use during war. And there in that dichotomy, you have what Labatut is after in this book, the incredible advances of science and the grim ways in which people often use it. Pamela mentioned up top the fact that the prose and a book succeeding on the terms an author set for it are a big part of this criteria. And I have to say that in both cases, this for me is a standout book. I have to mention here the translation work of Adrian Nathan West, who brings Labatut's book to us in all its glory. The prose is stunning throughout. And Labatut has taken us inside the feeling of creating and wrestling with these ideas. It's a feeling that can be exhilarating, claustrophobic, and maddening. And he sits us in this uncomfortable space where science allows us to know so much, to create so much, while also taunting us with the limits of our knowledge. Dave, I know that you were someone who was also pushing this book on people. What did you think of it?
I loved it. Yeah. I mean, there's just something naturally enticing about stories of unlocking some forbidden knowledge, you know, where it comes with huge power, but also a lot of danger and risk. I mean, it goes back to some of our oldest myths and legends. And while the subjects are 20th century figures and their discoveries are very much colored by the two world wars. There's still a timeless quality to the book, just a feeling that we're reading a sort of mythic text about knowledge quests. And for me, the book kept coming back to two related points. And the first is that it seems that the closer we get to this forbidden knowledge and this grand unifying theory of everything that some of these thinkers are chasing, the more terrifying that potential becomes. And in fact, some of the thinkers get to the brink and end up just walking back away from it because they glimpse what's beyond that edge and decide it's better just leaving it alone. And they see that the closer we get to that knowledge, ironically, the darker and more incomprehensible the world becomes. The second related point that I got is that all things exist in two ways. For example, there's a section devoted to the discovery, if you think back to high school physics, that light can exist in both wave and particle form. And it's just one of many moments in which the world gets ordered through these contradictory forms that seem like they should cancel each other out. You see it in knowledge and darkness, discoveries that, as John mentioned, advance human life, but also wipe it out. And you even see it in the form of the book as he starts to invent more and more as the book progresses. By the end of it, the work is both nonfiction and fiction. That might be a little bit unsettling, and I honestly wasn't quite sure how I felt about it, but I kind of have to believe that this is just a small taste of that first point, that in this world we don't understand, the truth is really multiple truths, and that there may actually be such a thing as alternative facts, maybe not in politics, but at least in the quantum world. So it's definitely not a book about the human mind triumphantly finding all the right answers. And I think it's way better for it.
Dave, thank you. Our fourth book in fiction is a debut novel by the essayist and poet Honoré Fanon Jeffers. And that book is The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. Lauren, tell us about this book.
There are a lot of strands within this 800-page novel, which really tells no less than the history of America through multiple generations of one Black family whose roots trace back to enslaved Africans and white slaveholders, and also the indigenous Creek people of what's now modern-day Georgia. I don't want anyone to be intimidated by the scale. What you need to know is that this is the story of a young girl. Her name is Ailey Pearl Garfield, and she's growing up in the 80s and 90s with two older sisters. Her father is a doctor in DC, which is referred to throughout as the city in the north. But in the summers, the family travels down to their ancestral home of Chickasetta, Georgia. And this is really where the pathos of the novel takes place. It's where Ailey learns from her great uncle Root, who's one of my favorite characters, about W.B. Du Bois's notions of double consciousness, as well as the talented 10th, concepts that really inform Ailey's entire coming of age through her education in HBCU, her reckoning with sexual trauma. And for me, this is the most moving part of the novel, her relationship with, her devotion to her older sister, Lydia, who, as she grows up, falls victim to the crack epidemic. This is Jeffers' first novel after several award-winning books of poetry, and you can really hear the poet's precision with language throughout, which is really even more astounding in a book of this length to me. It's truly epic. I mean, it's historical fiction that goes as deep as it does wide. You know, my favorite books are the ones that make you miss the characters when it's over, and just talking about them now makes me want to read it again. MJ, I know you felt strongly about this one as well.
I did. And I think what you said about how it goes as deep as it does wide hits it right on the nail, or the nail on the head. That's how that goes. I kept thinking of like a camera lens zooming in and out. It focuses so closely on Ailey and her coming of age and what that means for her as she's dealing with her family and trying to figure out how to be a person in the world. And then by flashing back to the songs of our ancestors, by flashing back to the founding of the Georgia landscape, or the American landscape, to flashing back to the stories of her sister and her mother, you get incrementally more and more of what makes up Ailey's world and how she fits within it. And this total lineage. It has scope and range. And wow, does this book have the range? I also just wanted to say, like, in its portrayal of a Black American family, it is so raw and empathetic. It had me hooting and hollering. Ailey Pearl knows how to drop a one-liner, let me tell you. It also had me mourning and grieving with this family and cheering with this family. And at the same time, then it flashes back to the past and it makes you think about America differently. It makes you think about how many untold stories go into the founding of this land, of the people here. A note about the length. I have the book here. It's a big book, and do not be intimidated by it. It is 800 pages. And at the end, I wanted more because you immerse yourself so deeply into this one family and their lineage that it pained me to step away from them. And that's a tremendous thing to do. And wow, this book is incredible. So please run and do not walk to go read it.
MJ, thank you. Our fifth and final book on the fiction side is No One is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. Gal, tell us your thoughts.
Patricia Lockwood, as some might know, is a poet. She's the author of a previous memoir, Priest Daddy, and something of a Twitter performance artist, I think you could say. And this book is billed as a novel, but I came to think of it more as sort of a prose poem, especially just because its language is so exquisite. And her subject, and it seems to be her universal subject, is the way we write and exist online. That constant churn that I know we all feel, from the banal to the sublime within the space of a minute. Many authors have tried to sort of capture that feeling, but I think that Lockwood nails it here in this book better than I've seen. And the most striking metaphor that she uses to describe this feeling in a book that's full of extraordinary metaphors is the notion of us on the internet as a kind of a school of fish. This is just to read you a bit of Lockwood making this point. She says that attention must turn like the shine on a school of fish all at once toward a new person to hate. Sometimes the subject was a war criminal, but other times it was someone who made a heinous substitution in guacamole. So that's Lockwood. It's hard to effectively describe the plot of this book, I should say. You sort of have to submit to its language and to Lockwood's kind of strange and interesting mind. But essentially, it's divided into two parts. The first has the narrator existing entirely within what she calls the portal, which is her sort of Twitter social media stand-in, capturing its ever-shifting gaze and how this way of being and communicating changes how she thinks and sees the world, the way she feels thrown into this big blender of memes. So you're there with her in it. And then the second half of the book shifts in tone and has the narrator dramatically thrust out of the portal by a real world event. And that's the pregnancy of her sister, who is carrying a child with a rare genetic disease, one that means the child will die soon after she's born. And this confrontation with reality and with the consciousness of the baby in particular during the short life of the child provides contrast for the narrator with her online existence, but it's also a way for Lockwood to explore what she presents as this state of presence, of nowness that she actually finds mirrored in the portal. There's a lot of real philosophical thinking about what it means for us day to day to be on social media, but it's done in this gorgeous language. And Lockwood wants us to think deeper ultimately about what the internet is good for, the magic that it can produce, and the idea of this giant mind that vacuums everything, that ebbs and flows and creates its own kind of unique collectivity. I found it to be a beautiful and profound book. Emily, I know you also enjoyed it.
Yes, I really admired this book. A critic I like once compared the effect of reading Patricia Lockwood to transubstantiation, writing something like you're looking at it on the page and it's becoming something else. And of course, that's an apt allusion to Lockwood's Catholic upbringing. If you've read Priest Daddy, her hilarious and brilliant memoir, you know that she grew up in rectories across the Midwest with a priest father, a very eccentric one. But I think transubstantiation is also a kind of apt description of her style. More than almost any contemporary writer I can think of, language in Lockwood's hands is deeply alive. It's this protean substance that can be or do literally anything, which is why I think the internet, with its social media platforms and its jumble of imagery and associations, is perfect fodder for her. She can fashion this poetic narrative out of this material, this kind of cultural detritus that is so revealing of who we are. Gal called the book a prose poem. I told my colleagues, I think this is the wasteland of 2021. And I wanted to read a short passage. Every passage in the book is short. The book unfolds in fragments reminiscent of a Twitter post or an Instagram post. And in this one, she's inside the portal, her term for the internet, and she writes, "She felt along the solid green marble of the day for the hairline crack that might let her out. This could not be forced. Outside, the air hung swagged, and the clouds sat in piles of couch stuffing. And in the south of the sky, there was a tender spot where a rainbow wanted to happen." I think this is such a characteristic passage. It's describing an experience that is both felt. She's groping her way inside the portal for the feeling of the day and seen. And her writing always suggests a kind of synesthesia as a permanent state. Words for her have shapes and colors and sounds, and every concept, abstract or literal, has a kind of tactile component. But as beautiful as this is, and I think Lockwood is finely attuned to beauty, she is also attuned to absurdity and hilarity. And finally, I would be remiss not to say seriousness. There is a seriousness of purpose beneath the play in this book. And I think that really is what Gall alluded to, a sort of meditation on the relative weight and meaning of experience on and offline that defines her life and increasingly ours.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. We are halfway through, which means it's time for nonfiction. And our first nonfiction book is Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath by Heather Clark. Emily, will stay with you on this one.
So this book, a biography of the poet Sylvia Plath, was published late in 2020. We were unable to consider it for Best Books last year, but as Pamela explained, according to our rules now, we were able to consider it this year. And it is a remarkable book. It's an exciting book, a book that a lot of us at the book review found riveting to read. And it's not at all obvious that it should be. After all, Plath has been the subject of so many biographies, as has her husband, the poet Ted Hughes, as has their relationship. Also, Red Comet runs to more than 1,000 pages with footnotes. There are a lot of big books on our list this year. And 1,000 pages, all for a woman who died by suicide in 1963 at the age of 30. So this book is a big and bold undertaking to write at such length about someone seemingly so thoroughly examined by scholars and critics and fans. But Clark has found a fresh way into Plath's life. And her goal, she says, is to rescue Plath from cliche, from her posthumous reputation as a kind of death-obsessed madwoman, a female hysteric. She writes that Plath has been so mythologized and pathologized and caricatured that we've lost sight of the qualities that distinguished her in life, a kind of rare intellectual and literary brilliance, what Clark calls, in a phrase I love, her ebullient, brainy essence. And that's what we get in this book. Clark declares at the outset that she thinks Plath is one of the most important American writers of the 20th century, which is quite a claim. But after reading the book, I was inclined to agree with her. And I should say quickly that Clark is a scholar. She's a professor of poetry at the University of Huddersfield in England. But this book is not at all academic. It's scholarly in the best sense of the word. It's deeply learned. And the amount of research it incorporates is staggering. It's all here. We get Plath's baby words, her first poem, age 5, her first published poem, age 8, her IQ, 160, genius level, her incredible high school English teacher in Wellesley, Massachusetts, Wilbury Crockett, who taught her for 3 years, during each of which the class read 40 to 50 works of great literature. He said he was astounded by her almost frightening talent, which is an impression she seems to have left on nearly anyone and everyone she met. Of course, we get her years at Smith and her formal thesaurus-influenced poetry in her early 20s, her time at Oxford, an incredibly textured portrait of her marriage to Ted Hughes, whose work she championed relentlessly, her psychological struggles, her late breakthrough poems, and through it all, this incredible work ethic, this unbending discipline that she had. But I think the real achievement of this biography is to take these granular details, all the thousands of grains of sand that made up Plath's life, and to animate them with her voice. This is what Clarke does because the sheer amount of writing that Plath left, her journals and scrapbooks, her poems and short stories, her novel, The Bell Jar, and letters, so many letters, it's dazzling. And you feel that you're in the presence of this rare and original human mind that witnessed and chronicled so much of mid-20th century literary life. I don't think I've read a biography in which the subject felt so intimately alive on every page. And I know Gall also loved this biography and has some thoughts.
Sometimes you come across books that just based on their subject matter, you know that you're bound to love. And this one, it's when you see a book where into page 200 or 300, she's still like 14 or 15 years old. I was like, how is this going to work? But the power of the book is actually, I think you said it, Emily, it's granularity. It's this kind of pointillist portrait of the artist. We see her developing almost day by day. And what she's struggling towards is self-expression. And I just love this kind of extreme close-up that we get of how she develops her confidence. She learns to trust her own creative powers. It just feels so special the way Clarke has put it all together. We see all the setbacks and the successes. She's not idealizing Plath in any way. We see her vanity and her insecurity. And more than anything else, we see this insatiable need to write, to create. The other thing I really appreciated about the book was the larger canvas that Clarke gives us, which is pretty amazing. We see a very fully fleshed out mid-century Cold War world in which Plath was operating in a time of just very repressive conformity. We learn about just how mental illness was treated at the time and the way Plath's own possibilities were just so confined, the walls against which she was pushing. And all of this makes you sort of root for her as a reader. I think you said it too, Emily. You feel like you get to know her so well, so that when this inevitable moment arrives, because if you know anything about Plath, it's that she died by suicide. You know, when that moment arrives, and I knew it was coming, of course, it still just filled me with such sadness and sort of losing her and her unique mind.
Well, thank you. Our second book on the nonfiction side is How the Word is Passed: A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America by Clint Smith. MJ, over to you.
I'm so excited that this book is on our list because I don't think there's any more pressing issue than how we talk about our history and our past. And Clint Smith in this book does it brilliantly. How the Word is Passed is not just about our history. It's not just a dive into our history, but it's a dive into how we tell the stories of our history. And Clint does that by visiting a handful of places in the US, from Monticello to Angola to New York City, and then one place abroad. And he looks at historical landmarks there. And he looks at how tour guides discuss the history, how visitors discuss that history, and what that conversation really looks like. What does it look like when we're trying to understand what came before us? In addition to just being very revelatory about some facts about these places, again, I mentioned New York City as it's discussing the past, and specifically Black history, how these places were implicated in the American slave trade and how that reverberates to today. You learn more details and the atmosphere about what made these places, how they operated, and how we can still see them today. I think Clint Smith's superpower is not just his writing, but how he listens. And that comes through on every single page, because Clint is not just telling you how people tell the story of this history. He is a character, and he's a central character in this book. He's telling you how people tell, specifically him, a Black man, this history, which is to say you are looking at people processing their own understanding of history, telling it to someone, and then realizing their own comfort level of telling something. Maybe they exaggerate something or they downplay something, and you're watching them grapple with the idea of history as it lives within them as they try to share it with someone else. I think Clint, as a writer and as a listener, is empathetic. He is rigorous. He is poetic. And as a result, this book, you come away with a very immersive understanding of what got us here as Americans. I know, Emily, that you love this book as well.
I did, MJ, and I agree with everything you said. I will echo MJ by saying his timing is pretty impeccable, given that we're in the midst of a national, often painful and politically fraught reckoning with the very history that he's writing about. Clint Smith is a poet and a journalist, and he's also got a PhD in education. And I think this is important to mention because although his book is about history, the history of slavery and its legacy today, his agenda is not so much didactic as it is documentary. What he's really interested in is what we Americans choose to know, choose to retain or ignore about our past. And this is what he means by how the word is passed. He's talking about our selective understanding, our selective memory. What do we as a country choose to know? So it's a very subtle and sophisticated project that he's undertaking, and he goes about it in such an unassuming manner. As MJ remarked, he's a visitor at these sites, engaging people he meets along the way, and he does an incredible amount of listening and observing, very little confronting or judging, even though much of what he encounters and records amounts to this dismaying catalog of willful ignorance. I so admired his restraint. One of the most, I think, discomforting visits he makes is to a chapel at a Confederate cemetery in Virginia where 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And he tries to engage the tour guides at the cemetery in a conversation about how they present and discuss the Confederate Army and the Civil War with their visitors. And he's repeatedly, politely rebuffed. I think you could take the Civil War aspect totally out of it and enjoy the beauty of the chapel's Tiffany stained glass windows, says one guide. And this is sort of a classic moment in the book where we get this kind of flickers of embarrassment and shame, but a kind of unwillingness to look at the source of that shame or that embarrassment. And I think this is the question that Smith keeps circling in this book. What is it that keeps us from looking at the actual facts of our history? And what will it take to get us to do that?
Emily, thank you. Our third book in nonfiction is On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed. Greg, over to you.
In some ways, this book pairs naturally with how the word is passed. There are overlaps, especially where Clint Smith visits Galveston and relates the history of Juneteenth when word of emancipation finally reached Texas. So the books amplify and inform each other in places. But what Annette Gordon-Reed is ultimately setting out to do is fit the story of Texas itself into the American story. And she does that in a series of essay-like chapters that offer a sweeping multicultural history about the state's indigenous roots and Latino population and slavery and the cowboy mythology, all of that on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's a personal history. It's a memoir of her own childhood in East Texas. She was the first Black student to integrate her town's white elementary school. So sort of a Texas version of Ruby Bridges, but without all the national media attention. And she gets into like the teenage appeal of Six Flags Great Adventure and illuminates what each of the Six Flags is. She tells us that Texas students have two different units devoted to Texas history in primary school. I think it's maybe 4th and 7th grades. For me, growing up in the New York suburbs, I learned nothing of Texas history except whatever mythology I picked up through pop culture, the Alamo and all of that. And one thing that Gordon-Reed is doing here is undertaking to counter those myths with a fuller understanding of the state's rich cultural heritage and vast geography. And she does that in an impressively small amount of space. Emily said there are a lot of giant books on this year's list. At 141 small pages, this is not one of them. But it ranges so far and accomplishes so much. It ends with a scene of a family Juneteenth celebration where her grandmother is making tamales, which brings together all of the book's strands as an American story. she opens the book saying that she originally felt a little put out or possessive when she first heard of people outside Texas celebrating Juneteenth. But one effect of this book for me was to make me think how shameful it is that everyone in America doesn't celebrate Juneteenth as the next step in realizing the country's founding principles. So I just loved this book. I read it before the Clint Smith. And then as I was reading the Clint Smith, I thought, well, do I love this book any less? And the answer is no. They really achieve different things. Pamela, I know that you liked this one too.
I want to talk about the book as it stands on its own merits, but it is hard not to talk about it slightly in conversation with the Clint Smith and we had this conversation many times in our discussion. If the Clint Smith is more about how we receive history, how we recreate history, about oral history, I think that for me, the Annette Gordon Reed on Juneteenth, while very personal, also is about the work of the historian and about how we write history and about the fact that history comes not from what the story we wish we could tell about ourselves or about others, but the stories that the facts present. And so beginning with the facts, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult they might be, and then going from there. And she tells a story in the book, a personal one again, that illustrated this conundrum, which is her father often believed deep in his heart that Black people in Texas had a natural coalition with the indigenous people of Texas, and that it was surprising to her to realize as a historian that in fact, the indigenous people in Texas often enslaved Black Texans. And so this was not the story that one would want to tell or want to believe, but it was one that the facts presented. And so I thought that the book worked both as a series of essays, and I think Gordon Reed said she modeled it on essays by James Baldwin and the mix of the personal and of her professional role, but really succeeded in using that kind of micro level to tell a much larger story about the history of slavery in this country. All right, I'm going to go to a very different book, our fourth nonfiction book. It is Invisible Child, Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City by Andrea Elliott. Liz, tell us about this one.
Well, this is another one of those really big books that we have been talking about. Invisible Child clocks in at 624 pages. I read it in less than 24 hours. It's that kind of book. If you're a regular reader of the New York Times, you might remember Andrea Elliott's 5-part series from 2013 about Dasani, an 11-year-old Black girl living with her parents and 7 siblings in a homeless shelter in Brooklyn. And Invisible Child goes back to Dasani and to her family and tells us what happened in the next 8 years, in the time following the period in which Dasani was dubbed by her classmates, not always kindly, as Homeless Kid of the Year. The book follows Dasani and her family from shelters to courts to welfare offices to therapy sessions to parties. It takes us across all the boroughs of New York City with both triumphant and heartbreaking detour to rural Pennsylvania. This is a book with many spoilers, so I don't want to tell you why Dasani is in rural Pennsylvania. The family's ups and downs, their joys and disappointments leave you with whiplash, worry, and the kind of empathy that really only comes from the most meticulous reporting. As Elliott brings Dasani's life into focus, she also zooms out and we get a look at the cycle of poverty and homelessness and the homeless crisis. And she also takes a very close look at Dasani's family history, including her great-grandfather's role as a decorated World War II vet. He was a Buffalo soldier. So we sort of come to understand how Dasani's story fits into this larger picture. Just on a personal note, I will say I think all of us here at the book review agree that it's a lot of fun to be the person who reads a book a couple months before it comes out. it gives you a kind of sense of, knowing something that other people don't know. But there are these occasional books that make you feel very lonely when you read them because you have nobody else to discuss them with. And for me, Invisible Child was one of those books. As I read it in that one long and kind of feverish day, I kept texting my colleagues and saying, you have to drop everything and read Invisible Child. And so now I recommend that you do the same. And Lauren Christensen, I know that you followed my advice and read the book and loved it. So maybe you can tell us your thoughts.
I think whiplash was a really great way to put it. There are moments of such overwhelming sadness and loss, when an unjust system rips apart children from their parents time and time again. But I think what makes this book so powerful are really those moments of, I don't want to say lightness, but the closeness between Dasani and her siblings, of course, their father, but also their mother. In the face of unthinkable odds, this family will really stun you with its just insistent love and humor and a really superhuman tenacity. Liz has summed it up so well. One thing I'll just add is how moved I was by Eliot's ability to balance journalistic rigor with so much heart. I think there are some instances when the journalist's ideal of, objectivity, of removing yourself from a subject, have to give way to the journalist's humanity. And I think that shows through really brilliantly in this book. I think it was a decade she spent really ethnographically observing the day-to-day lives of a single homeless family in New York City. Eliot doesn't just record their fates, she really inevitably impacts it. She doesn't hide that fact. Sometimes when these family members have no one else to turn to, Eliot is simply the only person who is reliably always there. And she explains in this really powerful afterword that for families like Dasani's, and really for any of us to a degree, whether or not someone simply shows up, it can really mean the difference between life and death. So it's just a remarkable achievement.
Lauren, Liz, thank you. We are up to our final book on the list and our second book in translation. The book is The Copenhagen Trilogy, Childhood, Youth, Dependency by Tove Ditlevsen. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Pamela. This book is actually 3 short memoirs, which were published in Denmark in the 1960s and 1970s. And now they've been published in a single volume in a translation by Tina Nunnally and Michael Favela Goldman. Ditlevsen became famous as a poet, but then went on to also write fiction and nonfiction. And although this isn't the first time her work has appeared in English, I suspect she'll be getting a lot more attention after this year when the Copenhagen Trilogy had many readers in its thrall. These memoirs cover Ditlevsen's years from adolescence to her early career and her marriages, and then to her addiction problems in her 30s. She grew up working class in Copenhagen, left school at 14 to work various menial jobs, but she always harbored a desire to write and publish, and she pursues that with a resolve that is just absolute and finds success fairly early on. But by the third book, she has some pretty disastrous marriages, the worst of which is to a doctor who initiates and then enables a very ruthless addiction to opiates. And the trilogy just runs you through a gamut of emotions. It's like a full service experience of funny and nerve-wracking and unbearably tragic, but it's never maudlin or syrupy. She's a very controlled writer, even though her voice could cut through steel. And throughout these books, you get the sense of a writer really just struggling to understand human impulse, right? The crazy and sometimes catastrophic things that love can lead you to do and that addiction can lead you to do. But on the other side, there's also the creative urge, which is maybe equally inexplicable and can reorder your life in inconvenient ways, and yet yield your best and most productive self. In Ditlevsen's case, I think we're very lucky to have the product of that. John, what did you think?
I love these books too, Dave. And I'll just say quickly, because a lot of the reviews rightly pointed out how harrowing this book is as a portrait of addiction in the third volume. And I just want to briefly say that the first volume, Childhood, I think doesn't get the press that it should for its just absolutely brilliant and artless balancing of her vision as an adult of all the things that happened to her in her relationship with her mother, and recapturing the sense of being that child and in the emotional thrall to that relationship. And I still don't quite know how she does it. She's a very subtle and precise writer. And so this is a book I think I'll reread over the years.
John, Dave, thank you so much. Every year, there are books that we deeply love that didn't end up on our final list, but we love them so much, we still want to share them with you. So I asked everyone to please just narrow it down to one favorite, which is very difficult for us. It was hard enough for us to get to consensus on the 10 best that we just discussed, but we'll each talk about one of our personal favorites, and I will start with Emily.
The book I want to mention is The Magician by Colm Tóibín, the Irish novelist. This is a work of historical fiction. It's a novelized portrait of the German writer Thomas Mann. And like all of Tóibín's novels, it's beautifully written and psychologically probing. It has similarities with Tóibín's novel about Henry James, The Master. That book was an acute psychological portrait of the novelist as a man thwarted by forbidden longings. And that's a subject Tóibín is very interested in, this idea of constraint, of repression, and its relationship to creativity, especially literary creativity. And in The Magician, we get a subtle, deeply empathetic portrait of Mann, who is constrained by a similar forbidding longing. His attraction to men is his most closely guarded secret, and one that hovers over his life, his literary career, his politics, including his timidity about criticizing Hitler and the rise of fascism in Germany, and especially over his domestic existence, which includes 6 colorful, couple of them truly flamboyant children who are given just really indelible lines of dialogue in this novel, and his beloved and loving wife, Katya, all memorably depicted in this wonderful book.
Lauren?
I have to confess 2 competing biases here. I'm not sure if they cancel each other out, but I have really always loved Kazuo Ishiguro, but I've also had a hard time getting into science fiction. So when I picked up Clara and the Sun, his latest book, and found out it was about a robot, I was just a little bit worried about which side I would end up on. But Ishiguro's gift as a storyteller is really to just never get bogged down in mechanics or terminology or even in, decorative flourish at the expense of narrative. I think this book is such a perfect example of pure storytelling. The narrator, Clara, is what Ishiguro terms an AF, or an artificial friend. She is unconditionally selfless. Her manners and morals are all impeccable. And in fact, her character is so flawless that it can really only be the product of science, not of nature. And it's such an interesting and fruitful decision that he made to tell the story through her lens, because she just constantly reflects back to us, very imperfect readers, everything we human beings, of course, are not. So the plot is Clara's purchased in a shop by, a very well-to-do mother for her lonely human child named Josie, who is part of a class of young people who are destined to become, quote, elevated members of society. Unlike the other elite kids, Josie is not long for this world. She has an illness. Clara has to decide whether she can truly stand in for her human companion. It's a parable, but it's, like I said, it's pure dramatic storytelling, and all in Ishiguro's signature unadorned prose. It really just lives up to the best of his work. So can't recommend it enough.
Lauren, thank you. It's so hard not to jump in and say, me too, I loved it too. We all had to kind of parse these out, but there are many fans of all of these books. It is my pleasure now to introduce the deputy editor of the Book Review, Tina Jordan. Over to you, Tina.
Hey, everyone. So people who know me know that I'm something of a crime thriller junkie. I probably read 100 or more a year. For some reason, it's my idea of relaxing reading. And Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby was far and away my favorite thriller of the year. In a nutshell, it's about 2 dads, one black, one white, who basically have 2 things in common. They're both ex-cons, and they both really struggled to accept the fact that their sons were gay. But when those sons who were married to one another are brutally murdered and the police seem to be fumbling the investigation, The dads join forces to investigate their deaths. While on one hand, this is sort of a high octane crime caper, on another level, it's this incredibly emotional tale of redemption. And for all its grit and gore and hard-charging plot, it's really a meditation on fathers and sons and on the ways that terrible grief and regret can affect us physically as well as emotionally. As the very title of the book, Razor Blade Tears, makes clear, but it's not mawkish in any way. Cosby just spins a great yarn. And while he's doing it, he's grappling with these big issues: homophobia, racism, poverty, class, you name it. But in such a big-hearted, clear-eyed way, and with lines that just sort of stop you in your tracks on every page. I just want to leave you with an example of one of those lines. One of the dads is talking to the other dad, and he says, "Folks like to talk about revenge like it's a righteous thing, but it's just hate in a nicer suit."
Tina, thank you so much. Such a fun book. And I feel like I can already picture the movie. Liz, over to you.
I would love to tell you about Wayward by Dana Spiotta. This is a novel about a midlife insomniac and the mother of a teenager who spontaneously buys a fixer-upper in downtown Syracuse and moves into it. She's running from something. Actually, she's running from everything: her marriage, her kid, her age, her aimlessness, her, I hate to use the term midlife crisis because it's so tired, but Spiotta brings a really fresh twist to this story. And what this woman finds is real and funny and honest and especially relatable if you live with a teenager whose resting expression is either benign tolerance or barely concealed disdain. Wayward reminded me of Ladder of Years by Ann Tyler, that wonderful book about a woman who walks away from her family in the middle of a vacation and begins a whole new life. For me, both of these books, but especially Wayward, were very close to home.
Liz, thank you. Gal, tell us about yours.
Yes. So I want to talk about a wonderful work of reportage. It's Eyal Press's Dirty Work: Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality. So Press wants to explore this idea of dirty work. That's the kind of phrase that he coins here. And these are the often sort of deeply morally compromised jobs that someone in society is doing so that the rest of us, quote unquote, good people, don't have to. And to give more grounding to this, he looks at three worlds in particular: at the guards and therapists working in prisons who are handling mentally ill people, at drone operators conducting, deadly operations by remote control, and also workers on the kill floors of meat processing plants. These are the three worlds that he enters very deeply. The most important contribution of this book, I could say, is just to give us a sense of this other inequality in America, this notion that there are some people forced to take these jobs, or that feel forced to take these jobs, that we don't want to think about, but are at the same time necessary. And the other thing he does so well is he gives us this concept of moral injury. We don't really like to imagine or do imagine that in American society, there are people that are suffering because they have to follow orders that go against their moral compass, essentially. But he shows us that there are, and we kind of step away from this book, or I stepped away from this book feeling like you shouldn't be looking away from them, and that you really need to grapple with the position that they're in.
Gal, thank you. Greg, personal favorite.
Sally Rooney's Beautiful World, Where Are You? encapsulates kind of where she is in her career right now. Sally Rooney is a young Irish novelist. This is her third novel, and she has had to bear a burden of extra textual fame since her first novel, Conversations with Friends, landed, and she was hailed as the voice of a generation. Her subsequent book, Normal People, was turned into a very successful streaming TV show. And so throughout her very young, very short career so far, she has had the weight, the outside apparatus of celebrity placed on her. And Beautiful World, Where Are You is a novel that for the first time now grapples with that. It's a novel about a friendship between two young women. One is a very famous young novelist named Alice, and her friend and kind of intellectual peer, Eileen, works as an assistant at a small literary journal in Dublin. The meat of the book is these long email exchanges between them about the nature of art, the nature of fame, whether novel writing is frivolous or whether it can sustain a culture, whether it has any role in culture with all of the distractions going on. Sally Rooney grapples with capitalism, late capitalism, and its role in her characters' lives. This is a book that goes there as well. It's a book that about 60 pages in, I told my 16-year-old daughter, I think you would really love this. And maybe 15 or 20 pages later, I said, you're not allowed to read this until you are 40, because it's also a book that is very sexy, very effectively sexy. It's a book that veers into eroticism in the relationship that the writer Alice gets into with a warehouse worker that pulls in a lot of the themes of class and capitalism that she's also playing with. In some ways, it's a very navel-gazing meta book, a famous novelist writing a novel about a famous novel. But Sally Rooney writes beautiful, unadorned sentences that filter what you sense is her real life into art by playing with these bigger ideas.
John, over to you.
I want to talk about Christine Smallwood's debut novel, The Life of the Mind. Smallwood has written very accomplished cultural criticism for many years, and this is her first book, which is always kind of a brave move for a critic to make. This book is about Dorothy, an adjunct professor of English, who is recovering physically and emotionally from a miscarriage, and also dealing with her academic job in what Smallwood describes as the decadent twilight of the profession. This book is just carried along by Smallwood's voice. I compared it to the work of Sam Lipsyte and Elif Bachman in the sense that she seems like one of those writers based on this first book who uses the novel just as an excuse, and a great one, for just roving psychological and cultural observation through the eyes of this character. And I flew through it, and I can't wait to see what she does in the future.
Dave, tell us about one of your favorites of the year.
2021 was a Franzen year. I feel like he's a comet that comes around like once every decade or so, or once every half decade, and either gets everyone really excited or pisses them off. This one I really liked. It covers one family, a mother, a father, and 4 children in suburban Chicago in the 1970s. And it's just a richly wrought family drama. But for me, the novel was also about a very important moral question, which is, how do we do good in the world without our own self-interest kind of getting in the way and ruining our intentions? Each member of the family is struggling with that question in their own way, but we also see it in America around them, which is fumbling its way through Vietnam and through a number of different domestic issues. And Franzen's just able to balance all of that without turning away from the family dynamics. And it was a tough book to put down. And the title is Crossroads by Jonathan Franzen.
Dave, thank you. MJ.
I want to talk about The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. It came out at the beginning of the year, and it just blew me away. It is a love story between 2 boys who were enslaved on a plantation. Their names are Isaiah and Samuel. And the book is really about what their love does to life on this plantation. And it does a great many things. The people on the plantation are warmed by it. They cherish it. They are jealous by it. At one point, someone tries to squash it. Other people try to steal it. And the book is this kaleidoscopic look at how everyone is looking at these boys, a portrait of life of enslaved people on a plantation. And what I loved about this book is how it expands our understanding of enslaved people, right? Because they were just that, people. And when we talk about the horrors of slavery, we rightly talk about the tragedy, the horrific nature of it, but we don't necessarily talk about the full range of humanity that enslaved people had and what they were able to feel. And that's love, right? And that's one aspect that doesn't get discussed a lot, that Robert Jones Jr. renders beautifully, poetically, rigorously in this book. You really see how the presence of this type of love, this all-encompassing, sacred love, raises the stakes for everyone individually on this plantation, personally on this plantation, humanly on this plantation. And then, I don't want to share any spoilers, but the book transforms in the last 50 pages. I was like breezing through it. I could not put it down. I'm still shook by the ending. So please come talk to me afterward about this book. But it is a remarkable book that I think is human and expansive and thoughtful and smart. And I would encourage everyone to go read it.
MJ, thank you. And thanks all of you. I'm going to add one personal favorite of mine, which is Our Country Friends by Gary Shteyngart. This is being called a pandemic novel, and it is. And that sounds absolutely terrible because we are still in a pandemic, and who feels like reading a novel about that? And yet this book, I think, is one of Gary's best, maybe even the best one. One of the things I love in a novel is a book that is fun and funny and makes me laugh. But one thing I like even more possibly is a book that makes me cry. This book does all of those things. It's totally enjoyable. I also think a little bit profound, and I will let readers discover the plot and the story for themselves. Okay, I'm going to run down one more time here, the full list. These are books that only a couple of us got a chance to talk about each today, but they were books that were truly broadly embraced across our team. This is a democratic process. There is voting, there's a runoff. So without further ado, once again, our 10 best books of 2021, How Beautiful We Were by Mbola Mabue, Intimacies by Katie Kitamura, When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut, translated by Adrian Nathan West, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Fanon Jeffers, No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath by Heather Clark, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America by Clint Smith, On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed, Invisible Child, Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City by Andrea Elliott, The Copenhagen Trilogy, Childhood, Youth, Dependency by Tove Ditlevsen, translated by Tina Nanali and Michael Favela Goldman. And there it is. The list will be published on nytimes.com today, and print subscribers, you can find it in your Sunday book review on December 12th. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.